This afternoon, we're going to discuss, get some information on the new fiscal relationship and contribution funding agreements with First Nations and the Government of Canada. And so we have a member from Onion Lake, Karla. She's going to do the honors of giving us the overview of the agreement. So with that, Karla, I'd like to welcome you.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for the invitation to come and share on the 10-year grants this afternoon with your community. I did hear through Okamal Lewis that we were invited to come and share the knowledge that we have from Onion Lake Cree Nation with your community. So with that, again, thank you for inviting me out on this beautiful day during the summer while we're trying to enjoy the weather outside while we have it. We get so few days of good weather, and it's really beautiful and nice to be able to come out and be able to be with you and in your arbor and with you as a community. So thank you for that invitation. We're always grateful to be able to share information with everyone that we can as we come across it. So one of the things that you may have heard about in your meetings is that the federal government has announced through Prime Minister Trudeau that he's looking for a new relationship. And with that new relationship, he announced as well that he was putting forward a new fiscal arrangement or agreement with First Nations. It sounds good when you first hear it, the word new, because we're so used to being underfunded. We're so used to not being treated well as First Nations. Those are the things that we look to correct. And so then it's those spin words, it's those opportunities that the federal government puts forward that tries to get nations to come and start new discussions. The challenge that Onion Lake saw and recognized with the wording is that these are legal documents they start to put the word new on. Our treaty and our inherent rights don't need a change. So that's some of the key and critical things that you need to recognize. So when we sat with lawyers and we reviewed the documents themselves, the connotation to new means a change. We don't need a change to what we have with treaty and our inherent rights. We need them to uphold our treaty and our inherent rights, to give us what was always promised instead of changing it. And that's unfortunately the reality we're in right now. Being part of a treaty technicians team, evaluating the work that the federal government has done over the last two terms of this federal government with Prime Minister Trudeau, the legislation that he has pushed through is about change. Not about honoring what should have always been. It is about change. The agreements themselves use words like evolve. So if you're going to evolve, and evolve in a way that it's not transparent on what the change will be. But you can see with the legislation that they put through under C-27, C-86, and C-97 that it's towards taxation, towards making us municipalities, towards changing and taking away from and looking away from what we have in treaty. So they're not looking at upholding our treaty and inherent rights. They've embedded these changes in their new legislations. So I am just going to give you a verbal review and update from my briefing note. I've shared it and left a copy here for your information package for later on that can be distributed to you at your request. But I'm going to go through all of the implications and all of the issues with these 10-year grants and actually the new contribution agreement, which are both built to comply with and to support the legislations that were put through. So Prime Minister Trudeau really has looked at and said he wants to finish the work his father did. Well, if you look at the work that his father did, it was about the termination of our treaty and our inherent rights. All under the guise of, I'm working with you, I want to do things better, we want to have different outcomes. But all along the way, as you'll see as I share the implications and the information here, it does change. Because the word new legally does change. That's what they want, is to change the relationship. So under the 10-year grants and new contribution agreements, the templates are actually funding mechanisms that are available to First Nations. That's how they'll share it with you federally. The 10-year grant is provided on written request for First Nations that meet the eligibility requirements. So we'll get to what eligibility requirements mean later on in the information that I present to you. But once again, a lot of this information is very detailed, and I've left a very detailed briefing note for you to take a look at. So I do appreciate you giving me this time this afternoon. These requirements, again, just as was noted, was co-developed with the Assembly of First Nations. From Onion Lake's perspective, and I have to talk about it from our experience, our perspective, and how we've analyzed it legally. Because you may look at it, others may look at it differently, but from our legal review and all the documents that we've looked at, and as our stand as a nation, one of the key factors in this is the federal government has engaged with the Assembly of First Nations, who is not a treaty signer. And it's continuing to be what they do and use for engagement and for consultation as the AFN. So instead of having to come to us as nations, they co-develop and take direction from the AFN, which is a challenge because they did not sign a treaty. So it was co-developed with them and the First Nations Financial Management Board out of BC. And if you do a research into their website, one of the things that they also monitor is taxation and taxation compliance out of that First Nations Financial Management Board. So this also links back to the taxation piece that is built into C-86, which we'll get into. So the Financial Management Board also assesses the financial performance and governance of its recipients. Again, why would they be elevated above us as nations? To continue to receive grant funding, the recipients will have to demonstrate that they continue to meet these eligibility requirements during the entire term of the grant. And these grants are for 10 years. So currently the templates that we've reviewed for the new contribution agreement and the 10-year grant are based on, as I said, Bill C-27, C-86, and C-97. And I've put it in the briefing note, the link on the website that you can take a look at for yourselves. Bill C-27, if you're not familiar with it, is the Financial Transparency Act. And when we evaluated what C-27 would do to us as a nation, it really wasn't about transparency for chief and council salaries, etc. and otherwise. It was about the non-First Nation tax associations to be able to see what we were doing under economic development, so that they could count what we had so that they could pressure for us to get moved into taxation and then also additionally pay for and count and use our own source revenues towards things like health services, education, other types of public health services, which many nations have had to do in order to supplement, to be able to even get enough services for themselves, because we are 65 to 85% underfunded. How do you keep nurses if your health service agreement doesn't even give you enough to pay the salaries at the union rates the same way they do with the province? The recruitment and retention issues are extremely real, and it becomes hard. So that Financial Transparency Act, they couched it on, well, we want to be able to see people's salaries. They back-ended it on the politicians to blame the politicians, but it's smoke and mirrors. C86, it includes required harmonization of laws. What does that mean, harmonization of laws? So there's actually, within the legislation itself, it outlines and it stipulates that our laws can't be greater than the provincial or federal laws. Yet as nations, when we develop laws holistically, when we develop a health law, or we look and develop a child welfare law, and we do it in a holistic manner, we're saying we're doing it equal to or greater than both of their systems. Yet in their own C86 legislation, they said they will not acknowledge that it's greater than theirs. Because what have we gotten for outcomes by using their laws? We're underfunded. They admit through their own national research that their health system is broken. There's inconsistencies all across Canada. We're feeling the brute force of it during a pandemic as we struggle through these times. So that's what they built into Bill C-86. Harmonize. Can't possibly be better than them. Why would they acknowledge that? They might actually have to fund us better if they acknowledge that. If we were funded in a holistic way, we'd have those better outcomes. And we would have had those better outcomes throughout this entire time. If you look at, and I know you've had a full discussion this morning on COVID-19. How many tests, just food for thought, you can write that question later. How many tests did your nation receive compared to how many tests they received provincially to be able to test your community? Some of the key and very critical things that the medical health officers said, right, is testing. Know where the COVID-19 is, but how can you know where it is if you don't have the tests to do it? In Saskatchewan, when the health directors got on a regional call to compare how many tests that they got, one nation said they got 19 tests, and that's all they still have for over 3,000 people. Yet how much do they have off reserve? So these are the things that I talk about when I'm talking about there needs to be a different response. If we were being treated properly, if we were being provided for adequately, then how would that look? How is this harmonization working for us if that's what we agree to? If we were being funded holistically, we would have been provided equal to or even greater than, right? Even in COVID-19, during the pandemic. Property taxation is another one that they're trying to bring in because they're saying it's going to be the answer to the housing issue. Yet if somebody can, and this has happened already in BC to a couple of nations, people have not been able to pay those property taxes. They lost their homes. So all these things that are great ideas, but what happens to the most vulnerable? Those are the things that I think about first when the great ideas come to the table. It is a move towards individual rights, and that's what's embedded in C86. Individual personal rights, getting away from our collective rights as nations, because that's what they did in New Zealand. And that's how they lost in New Zealand. We've been talking to lawyers in New Zealand on what happened with their treaty, how their treaty got impacted, and one of the things, and Janice could even speak to this if you wanted to later on, she could share that more deeply with you at another time, where when they moved to individual rights, that's how they broke down their treaty, and they started to lose their treaty inherent rights as a collective. C86 is that starting point with that. We can share that with you later on. We'll just give you a breakdown of all the clauses from those laws. It would take a day and a half to go through all of those clauses that they put through. C86 was 900 pages, almost 900 pages long. C97 was 400 or so pages long. So they hid all of these changes in 2 budget bills. They didn't think we'd find the information. They were hoping we didn't find the information. So that was the other thing. It's not transparent what they've done. So as a nation, we do share this as openly as we can, as often as we can with other nations. C97, they put in there what's called Division 25. It states that institutions and organizations will be funded, such as the AFN. So if the AFN is being funded at a very increased level, and there's no new money, then whose funding is going to be decreased? And they didn't sign treaty. So for us as a nation, there's 2 impacts there that we have to monitor. Especially when we're on the path of doing a treaty-based funding arrangement. And as soon as we get into discussions on treaty-based funding, which is more needs-based, what happens to us as Onion Lake Cree Nation is they say, well, AFN agreed to something else, to a formula that we presented to them. But right now, every time we evaluate those formulas, it's always 65 to 85% underfunded. So then they get you to agree to the underfunding, because you have to have something. And that's how they wash their hands of their own liability. They make it seem like a lot of money, because some money is better than none to some degree. And that's how they have continued to do business historically all the way through the time that they've dealt with us. So this is a clause actually straight out of the grant and the contribution agreement itself. It says, if the party receiving funding is a corporation or society, but not a tribal council, use the following. Note that of the jurisdiction of incorporation may be federal. An example, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act or provincial territorial. Records of incorporation should be kept on file and updated. It's interesting that the province is in here. We didn't make treaty with the province. So just some red flags as you go through it, and just read the simple wording. Again, treaty is based on a nation-to-nation level. We did not give our authority. We didn't give the ability for an incorporation to speak for us. So incorporated bodies who did not sign treaty should not have the power to speak for or represent nations. But that's what this is being tried to move toward. It happened in Australia too. So again, if you'd like more information on the New Zealand and the Australia pieces, I mean, you could we'll share that information with you as well. In Australia, what they did, they moved in that model towards incorporations speaking for the nations. When the incorporations failed, then they pulled the money from the incorporations, and then the money ended. So it's a slow-moving track. If it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. We don't need a new fiscal relationship. Again, that piece about new, I'm just going to read you a couple of the clauses that are straight in those arrangements. They have the words new all over them: evolve, change. Talk to a lawyer. If you have an original contract with somebody, now they start saying the words new, change, evolve. Your lawyer will advise you. There's a liability, but what they can do to what your original arrangement was. You need to review what those impacts are. The parties anticipate that the terms, and this is clauses out of the arrangement itself. So the parties anticipate that the terms and conditions of this agreement may evolve over time, and that such changes may be informed by policy processes between Canada and First Nations. So what's interesting to me about that and concerning to me about that is may be informed by policy processes. They make changes to policy all of the time without even talking to us. That's significant impacts on nations. That's a constant thing that's always happened. Non-insured health benefits. How many times has your treaty right to health been impacted because of policy changes? And they never talked to First Nations, not once. They've arbitrarily made those policy changes. Evolve. So evolve by the new fiscal arrangement. Again, this is a dangerous term, trying to impact the original relationship and responsibilities. That word evolve. Again, there's a reason why they put it legally into a document. It means change. We never received what was part of the original commitments, and has always been a state of getting less or trying to sever the responsibilities that the state of Canada has to treat our treaty inherent rights. They've just trying to what they're trying to do is just slowly, in incremental ways, move that yardstick further and further and further and further away, instead of getting closer to upholding what they should have done originally. Putting in just the arbitrary word evolve, to me, in my own opinion, and talking to some legal experts, it's not transparent. You put that word in there and it's a state of diminishing rights, and it's not honoring the intent and the spirit of treaty. So anytime you assert a change, making something new, again, just to reiterate that, new, the word new, legally you are changing what you had. So I talk about 65 to 85% underfunding. How do I know that? So Onion Lake went through an exercise, and what we did was, and to give you just some very simple examples, we looked at what we got for and received funding to pay nurses. And we looked at what we got in our Onion Lake Health Agreement. And then we looked at what the province was provided under their transfer. And the disparity, just even on salaries alone, from one system to the other system, was 65 to 85%. And it was consistent, and why we say 65 to 85%, because in whatever area we studied, it landed within those ranges. So we also looked at operations. How much we should have to maintain our building. How much we should have to have some finance people around. How much we should have to have computers and IT. All of those things that the federal government does for themselves, but completely underfunds us for. And they continue to do it. So clauses have been added to all State of Canada agreements with First Nations in order to protect the State of Canada from being liable for the underfunding. They know they have restricted First Nations to receiving. We had a conversation with one of the most senior people in Ottawa, and they actually explained that to us, that as Saskatchewan went through transfer in the 90s, one of the things that happened was the issue around underfunding for nurses and nursing salaries. And we won on our side. So they had to course correct and adjust the funding at that time, early on in the transfer of the funding agreement. So they got legal advice, and they added a clause into the agreements to make sure that it was embedded in their agreements, that we were agreeing to what we were receiving. Because if we agreed to what we received, then we've already given something up, and we can't go to court with it. It's built in to the clauses. They know they're liable and have created negative implications and outcomes for First Nations communities in order to save themselves from the implication of the full liability in force. And they force First Nations to sign the agreements. Again, how many times have you been asked to sign an agreement at the 11th hour? Hurry up, there's only a week left, or there's only a few weeks left, or there's only a few days left. You're not going to get your money for your community if you don't hurry up and sign. So it's always under duress for quite a few things. It's caused communities that are impoverished, unhealthily and hampered, and was knowingly done. Legal wording was and has been included to insulate themselves from their liability. The stacking clause that's in this agreement as well, I'm going to cover that just quickly here. Built on the concept of borrowing Peter to pay Paul. Honestly. We tried to negotiate to change that stacking clause, but because we really felt that the wording in the new contribution agreements or the grant funding agreement or any of their new agreements at all, at this point in time, they're saying that, okay, you get the opportunity to go into this 10-year grant, but if there's issues, you can move around money, right? It's the most flexible agreement out there. You can move around money. But they're not going to give you any increased money to close the gap for the 65 to 85%. So your most challenged departments, think about them, housing. What other departments that are really hampered? Probably your maintenance, some of your roads, some of the infrastructure things that you think about for your community. So maybe the opportunity they'll say is, well, we'll move some from health over to housing. But we already know health is underfunded 65 to 85%. How do you balance the books over 10 years doing that? But in the end, as you go along, it's going to start to catch up to you. It's not something that's sustainable. Flexibility is fine. I make this comment every time I get on the conference call or face-to-face meeting with the feds that we meet with. And when they say flexible, 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 I'm going, flexible, that's great. You're asking me to spend the same dollar 4 times. Flexibility doesn't do me any good if you're going to ask me to spend the same dollar 4 times. That's basically what this ends up doing to you. How will that balance financially in the end? They've said that they will keep with the 2 to 3% increases per year. We know that's not getting anywhere near closing that 65 to 85% gap, though. Offers you solutions to get a loan against the funds. That's kind of like asking us to go to Money Mart. Sorry. So you'll borrow, but then you're going to end up short eventually. And then what's going to happen to the default? So I know the Yellowhead Institute and others have done evaluations on this funding agreement, and one of the things that came up as a huge red flag is if you take loans against these funds, what kind of a surety are they going to ask you to guarantee these loans on? Most nations, all they have is their land. So what are they risking? The only thing they have. A First Nation must put themselves under the First Nations Financial Management Board out of BC, and it's part of their mandate, again, is taxation compliance. So the eligibility requirements means they need a finance admin law, which is certified by the Financial Management Board, but that's all built under Canada's legislation. C80, C27, C86, C97. So then, now you're going to agree, and they're going to say, well, but you agreed to it. Implications, I've got an implications section, just to give you some more details on this. I'm just going to touch on what I haven't touched on. You got to be careful when they say new at any time, because it redefines the terms. Again, we don't need them to redefine any terms. One of the things in C86 they haven't touched on yet is the area of Indian monies. Indian monies are protected under our original treaty and inherent right relationship. And what they want to do right now is they want to sever that definition. They want to put our Indian monies into a general revenue fund so that it's not coming directly out of our Indian trust anymore, which then severs the protection of our Indian monies from taxation. That's in C86. So the legal work being done to try and affect Indian monies is to distance the state of Canada from the origin of that definition. If this was not true, then why did they enact the legislation that confirms what Indian monies are in C86, and then trying to attempt to redefine it in C86? In the agreement itself, there's another clause that I found very interesting. Because all of the money that we get, our Indian monies, comes from our trust. They're trying to paint a different story. Tell us that's not true. Because they think if they say it long enough that people will forget. The wording that they put in these agreements, and you sit down with them and you read these clauses, it says, debt due to the Crown. That's funny. I thought it was our money. So how do I owe you as a Crown if it's our money? So again, it's that changing of wording so that they try to get people to forget over time our original relationship and where our monies really come from. I don't think, in my opinion, that it shouldn't even be included in there as wording. Why would we be reimbursing Canada from our monies? If anything, and this is, as Onion Lake Cree Nation, our leadership feels very strongly about this, we're receiving monies on behalf of our nation members. So who should we be It's not a debt we owe Canada if something happens. The accountability belongs to our community. Because it's their money we're receiving to use well for their health, their well-being, for our future generations. So Onion Lake was advised that they have offered that debt due to the Crown could be paid by own source revenue. So it's another option that they've laid out there, that we could, if we owed them anything, pay it back to them. Another interesting reason why they would want to evaluate how much economic development dollars we have. Why should the First Nation bear these costs at all? Right? It is the nation's own money that is being held back that creates these deficits. This is aligning with the state of Canada's desire to impact Indian monies. Because if you think about it, we're 65 to 85% underfunded. Then they're going to tell us that we're in deficit, so we owe somebody. But we're 65 to 85% underfunded. There's something crooked going on there. It doesn't add up. They don't do that to themselves federally. I can guarantee you they don't do that to themselves federally. In Manitoba, when they have deficits, their federal employees apply for additional funding to cover their deficits. That's what happens in Manitoba. The other piece to this is the intent to make First Nations minorities in Canada and moving them towards operating and establishing themselves as a municipality or fourth order of government. That ties back to, okay, the own source revenue, you're going to use your own source revenue, you're going to create taxation. That's how you're going to be able to create increased funding for your underfunded areas. So the assertion of the state of Canada's laws does have an impact on us if we walk into that. C-86, again, going back to that issue with the harmonization of laws, and it does push us things into a fourth order of government. The refusal to acknowledge our laws and insisting that we must include the state of Canada's laws that are not applicable in the arrangements is not transparent. Instead, gives the flag that they are trying to get us to agree to laws that we've been fighting through signing agreements. So there's been this huge national push on climate change, protecting our land, protecting our water. Yet in these agreements, whether it's the grant agreement or whether it's the contribution agreement, I find it interesting that they give these general clauses that are included in these arrangements that require us to fully comply to Canada's legislation on climate change and or development, when the laws that they have put in place and are putting forward are impacting our water rights, our land rights, and our ability to protect our nations, if you look at what's going on even with the pipeline. So for self-government, we've learned through our discussions for Onion Lake, talking to the federal government, talking to their senior representatives, talking to their ministers in Ottawa. Self-government, the state of Canada's definition of self-government for First Nations really is taxation. Giving up our 9124 rights, and very simply putting us into a fourth level of government. And they're trying to, again, just move the yardstick slowly, little bit by little bit by little bit, through things like grants, contribution agreements. They heard that we wanted to get our funding in a grant-type way. So they hopped on that, developed something to present to us under a grant-type arrangement, while still keeping all of the things that they wanted on their termination agenda to affect our treaty inherent rights. Again, the Taxpayers Association, it's actually, if you look at it, even with the harmonization of laws piece, And this is what I wanted a tax lawyer to provide us, and I've asked for it and I still haven't received it, and we'll share it when we do receive it. Janice and I went to a forum in November, and we talked about this. We had somebody who's a tax lawyer in our session. And I said, okay, so we've got the harmonization of laws, and they're saying that our laws cannot be greater than theirs, provincially and federally. Is that their opportunity to push the taxation issue? Because if we agree to that, then treaty inherent rights gives us the tax-free status. But if we're giving up that by arbitrarily agreeing with them or signing these arrangements, we're agreeing to the harmonization. Is that where we're going? Legally, that's the intent. So I wanted a tax lawyer to give an official briefing note. I read it. It's plain to me. I wanted him to also provide it. That's why that harmonization of laws, saying our laws can't be greater than theirs, right? Because right now, we're Citizens Plus. So what does harmonization do to us then? Does it remove Citizens Plus? Because that's the intent, right? It's always been the intent. The other one that came out as a huge red flag as well, and I saw this because my old job was in child welfare. So I was a regional director in Saskatchewan for child welfare before I went home to work for Onion Lake. And we were fighting, and we won under the tribunal. And one of the things that was successfully done through that tribunal was we ended up with open funding for child welfare. And so we've heard, and I've heard directly, and the grave concern the federal government has is they consider that open funding a liability to them. So one of the discussions that was had in Saskatchewan was, well, we need to get into this 10-year grant. It'll help. It'll help get us more money after we win the tribunal decision. But not listening to the fact that it caps the funding. So you go from winning a tribunal decision to suddenly, again, they can wash their hands because they got you agree to sign an agreement that caps your funding. So the federal government has been desperate to somehow quarantine, limit the impacts of what's happened from that tribunal decision as well. Under C-97, it also transfers the liability to the nation. But why should we as nations take on the full force of the liability legally at court, etc., and otherwise for everything that they have done to us intergenerationally? Can we afford to pay millions and millions and millions of dollars in child welfare cases? They are looking to put it back on us, but they're the ones that did the damage. So even C-97 itself, it's all built on all these legislations. The foundation of them is for them to wash their hands. We've won too much. So I had to find a way legally to try and put walls around what we've done, limit the things that we've done, things that we've been able to accomplish. I recognized the issue around own source revenue, and they touted it as one of the solutions when they were presenting this to Onion Lake as well. You can use your own source revenue to offset the underfunding. So we're going to use our own source revenue that comes from a non-renewable resource that at some point, sooner than later, unfortunately, will run dry. then what? If we'd signed the 10-year agreement, pandemic hit this year. What happened to the price of oil? We would have been in a lot of trouble, critical trouble, if we would have agreed to that as a nation. Again, I'm just going to read this one again, because I think it bears repeating. Transfer of funding to institutions and organizations, such as AFN, and I won't list the other ones, is separating the fiduciary responsibility from the federal government and their continued treaty obligations. They did it in Australia. So if you want to hear again more in depth about what happened in Australia and New Zealand, I encourage you to take some time to do that as well. Both of the options, and I'm going to read through this one specifically because there'll be some people in here that are very interested in the specifics on this. The 10-year grant and the new contribution agreement do not provide needs-based funding, population funding, nor does it provide culturally relevant care-based funding. So they refuse to acknowledge our laws and insist that we must include the state of Canada's laws that are not applicable. Because if they accepted our law, then they would have to fund us better. And we would have better outcomes. They see that as disturbing their equilibrium, because the internal comment I've heard, well then what would happen to non-First Nations people? That's not my problem. Not to be disrespectful. Change your system. Feds, change your system. Province, change your system. If you know you're not doing right, change your system. Don't punish us as nations because you won't do better for your own people. Indemnification. That's actually the one that I was talking about. That's the clause specifically that I was talking about. Go and read that indemnification clause thoroughly. That's the one that I was talking about, on them using it to wash their hands of their liability. I'm not going to read this verbatim. You've got that in the briefing note. I think I've covered it quite a bit. I won't go over it again. But I think that you can take a look at that. I've copied it and pasted it into the briefing note. But again, that is, again, them washing their hands. I know they're not doing right by us. But if they can get you to agree in writing, right? They can walk away from the liability of it. Binding, the word binding in the agreement itself, it says it's got a binding nature. And the challenge that I have with this one is that it's in both versions. Is the binding nature, the rights impacted in this agreement will be binding on future parties. So they're saying, well, don't worry about it. You know, if you make a mistake, don't worry about it. Binding on future parties. Again, do further legal review if you need to on that. But we looked at that for ourselves. Under that Financial Management Board of BC, again, they're asking for you to do a financial administration law or a financial administration bylaw. And again, this template was co-developed with AFN, and it's controlled by the federal government. And it does line up and link to taxation. So the grant funding, Canada's pre-established eligibility requirements tied to having to give up your rights. Because C27, C86, C92, C97, all of those. Again, we can give you the copy of the clauses from those legislations to show you directly. If the First Nation no longer meets Canada's eligibility requirements for grant funding for any activity, Canada may require to repay to Canada up to the full amount of the grant funding paid to your nation. So I'm going to read that again because I think it's the highest risk. If you haven't read that clause in the agreement itself, I'm going to read that again. If the First Nation no longer meets Canada's eligibility requirements for grant funding for any activity, Canada may require to repay to Canada up to the full amount of the grant funding paid to your nation for that activity of the grant funding. So, are you fully aware of what the eligibility requirements are? It's quite complex. 10 years is a long time to be 65 to 85% underfunded. And you're under status quo. If they've said, the feds have said, the federal government representatives, they said that if we announce new funding, of course, you'll get that funding. If we announce you're getting a 2% or 3% increase, of course, you're going to get that funding. But I specifically asked at the ministerial level, at the ADM level, at the deputy minister level, and their funding officers, their most senior funding officers, I said, are you going to provide sustainability? Are you going to close that 65 to 85% underfunding gap? They said no. So cost sharing. This is another spin word that they put in the agreement itself and in the discussions that they've done with many nations, and I've heard it. So again, under the guise of, well, you can establish your own taxation, establish your own property taxes, pay for it through own source revenue, because in their perspective, it is about us self-funding through under their self-government definition. This was another statement that I heard from one of the representatives. Sustainability to the state of Canada right now has meant how much, and this is a quote, how much you contribute to the state of Canada. I think we already gave up enough. We already gave up enough. Through the AFM, Fiscal Relations Table report included wording, how this benefits Canada. One of the priorities. Not how they uphold the original treaty and inherent relationship with us. One of the priorities. How this benefits Canada. I find that extremely concerning and a huge red flag. Even with the establishment of Indigenous Services Canada itself, that was strategic. You've got ISK on one side and CERNAC on the other. So on the ISK side, that's all of the nations that they think they're going to get into this new contribution agreement, which still is written and the template written on all of those legislations. And the CERNAC side, where they can get nations into self-government agreements. And we've already talked about what self-government means. So one of the things that we found interesting is that they pitched establishing ISK as an efficiencies exercise. They're going to amalgamate departments, reduce costs, put more control into First Nations hands. Yet, Senator Scott Tanis, in December 2019, he actually disclosed that it's actually costing double, if not more. Alberta Senator Scott Tanis says the federal government is spending $4 billion more. This doesn't come to the First Nations, just in the federal bureaucracy. Since creating the 2 Indigenous Service Departments out of 1 in 2017. The Senate National Finance Committee was told, when I'm looking at the amount of money being spent by both departments, if you add them up together, it's $18 billion. Previously, the Department of Indian Affairs had $12 billion budget with another $2.14 billion worth. So 14, just about $15 billion. There's also now, and this is what I find interesting, if we're more in control, and they're saying they're devolving the control to us, they, before the split, had 4,627 employees. Now they have 8,315 as of December 2019. Canadians want to make sure that the money gets into the hands of the Indigenous people and doesn't support a bloated bureaucracy in Ottawa, said Tanis. And no audit of the increased costs has been made publicly. How very interesting. C-27 for us, but no transparency for them. Eligibility definitions, I'm just about done. Thank you for your patience. I know this is a lot of information. Eligibility definitions, financial performance ratios. So these are actually in the agreement. You can have somebody show you, or you can go online on the link that I sent. And there's ratios there. So it has average fiscal growth rates that you have to meet in your margins as a nation. And if you fail, then you're not eligible anymore. So what does it say? You're not eligible anymore. They can ask you to fully repay. And what if you took a loan out? What are you going to do if that happens? This pandemic is a critical lesson for us. What has happened to us as nations financially during this pandemic? We have had to fight tooth and nail in Saskatchewan to make sure that they didn't reduce our funding, because they themselves made the comment on one of the national calls and on the regional calls. They said, well, what are you doing? What work are you doing anyway? And in my head I'm going, gee, Janice and I keep working full-time and still working overtime, and I work in a health center. We didn't close our doors. We're not hiding at home. We're still working. Federal government won't even come out to meet us face to face. I find that interesting. So just going to end off on this. Under exceptional circumstances, I'm just going to read to you a quote on what it has in those arrangements. And we've been fighting this wording all along, because really that hits at the heart of what we're dealing with right now and what we could be dealing with for the next couple of years. If a federal department agrees to change the level of funding, this agreement will be amended accordingly. So they have to agree that we need money, more money, during a pandemic. You can ask your chief of council if they feel that they've gotten adequate funding to be able to help you as a community during this pandemic. How short has it been? Lots of political phone calls to be very, very strong in the ears of the deputy ministers and the ministers to get any kind of funding. One of the frustrating things that I watched as I watched the updates from Minister Miller, Trudeau, and all of his representatives, they kept saying the answer to First Nations during this pandemic is the lockdowns. That's interesting. The medical health officers that are providing advice to the rest of Canada have said that you must do much more than that. has to be testing, right? There has to be a very comprehensive approach, contact tracing. You need to be able to have the ability to quarantine people. So they've done all of this for themselves. And they've beefed up all of their own systems. How much have they done for us? And I just simply use the example that is very easy for me to share on the tests. Onion Lake sat with about 11 to 18 tests for 4 to 6 weeks at the beginning of this pandemic. It wasn't until we got political and decided that to tell them, maybe we can make this public if you don't provide us more. 12 to 18 tests for 6,700 people. If we would have had a handful of positive people, it would have created a very bad outcome for us. And we're not the only ones. And the province was getting much, much more, because I was tracking it. So if that doesn't tell you that they have an agenda, I don't know what else will. We have to do something differently. We have to do something more. We need to require them to provide for our need, to uphold our treaty inherent rights, to do better. And we're just sharing our information on what we understand and what we've done legal reviews on, and what we've been able to discover with their legal language that they're putting in their contribution agreements and tenure grants and their legislation. I think your leadership has probably heard this numbers of times, how they feel that non-insured health benefits is such a burden for the federal government. Such a burden. We gave up all our land, but what do we ask for in return? These are times that we have to be careful. One of the things that they're doing, and I know they're doing it, they're taking the opportunity so that we don't share, can't get together, don't do these types of discussions, because they do have a goal of having a certain number of these signed by next year. Onion Lake, as a response, we're still in our discussions with treaty-based funding arrangement. We've not completed our discussions yet. We're at the tail end of our discussions and our negotiations. But what we've done is extend our old arrangements that doesn't have all of these legislations embedded in it, and just extended it. And we just keep extending it. And we'll keep doing that until we get a different outcome. Because it is binding on future parties. It will impact your future generations. These are the things that are going on. Well, we've shared this quite a number of times and done our best, so once again, just extending our gratitude from ourselves as technicians, and from Okamau, Lewis, and from our leadership for extending the invitation to us to be able to share what we understand. Again, I'll say it from that perspective, because a lot of even my experience from my side is from being a directly transferred arrangement in Saskatchewan. I know there's other things that you will want to hear, because Alberta, some of the arrangements aren't directly transferred, so there is some differences. But what's the same are these templates. They're the same across the board, all across Canada. So that's why I think they thought that it would be good information for you to be able to hear that today. So with that, I thank you, and hi.